Okay, so welcome to Educators Podcast. My name is Swapnil. I'm intensivist at Sydney, and today we have a very high-profile guest in our studio. His name is Professor Jonathan Sherbino. He is a world-renowned educator, podcaster, and blogger who works as an emergency physician and trauma team leader in an inner-city tertiary hospital in Canada. He is a professor in the Department of Medicine at McMaster University and serves as an assistant dean of the McMaster Education Research, Innovation, and Theory program, that is Merit. He is the chair of Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons Emergency Medicine Specialty Committee, co-chair of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons Clinician Educator Diploma program, and past vice chair of academic section of the Canadian Association of Emergency Physicians. He is the editor in chief of the ICE, that is International Clinician Educators blog, co host of the bi weekly Keyline Podcast, and is co chair of the International Conference on Residency Education. He is the past associate editor of education for the Canadian Journal of Emergency Medicine. His education scholarship focuses on clinical reasoning, competency based medical education, and assessment. So, welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Swapnil, for the invitation. I'm excited to be here. I'm pretty embarrassed by you reading all of that, but I think the listeners should know first, I'm a clinician, and then I also play a role as an education researcher. So the application of theory is really important to me.
It's great to have you here, Jonathan. And looking at your bio, it's very inspirational for any budding educator. So thanks for joining us today. Now, before we proceed, how's weather there in Canada?
Well, it's the summer here. I know you're experiencing winter, so this is the one time where you never want to leave Canada. Normally, we're about 6 feet deep in snow and ice, but right now it's sunny. My kids are about to go jump in the pool, and school is letting out as of tomorrow. So it's a great time to be a Canadian.
Perfect. And are you following the World Cup soccer?
I am. I'm pretty excited to see England and how they're doing. They seem to be my team this year. Although my son is cheering for France, so we're having lots of debates inside the Sherbino household.
Oh, I'm going for Brazil. So let's see who wins the cup.
You have a much higher probability if you're cheering for Brazil than England.
Let's see. So, Jonathan, we are going to talk about a topic that is very close to your heart, and you have published extensively on this topic, that is competency based medical education. To be honest, there are a lot of educators out there who still don't know much about this topic or concept. Will you able to explain it a bit more to our listeners, please?
Sure. I think that in the medical education literature, this idea of competency-based medical education is really dominating conversations. But it's not new. It's something that's at least 2 or 3 decades old as a phenomenon, and even older if you go outside of health professions education literature. The origins really come from an outcomes-based approach to learning. The idea is if you can begin with the end in mind, establishing what you want a competent graduate of your residency training program to look like, then you can reverse engineer that program in a way that imagines that an individual learns at a unique pace that is not dependent on the change in the calendar year. So our current structure for competency-based or our current structure for residency education is we imagine that everybody learns at the same pace, and the calendar determines when you move from novice to intermediate to senior. And if you say it out loud like that, you say, well, that seems ridiculous. We all know that in our own experiences, we've mastered certain abilities much faster than others. And so competency-based medical education is really capturing the minds of educators because it offers a kind of a fundamental reorganization of our graduate medical education. Having said that, it's not without its challenges and it's not without its untested assumptions. So maybe over the course of our conversation, we can unpack what I think are the 4 key themes that make up competency-based education.
Okay, that will be great. So, and I can see now in US and Canada there is a big movement of changing the assessment structure, and a lot of emphasis is given on interestable professional activity, that is EPA. How has it been perceived by academics and more importantly by students?
So EPAs and the changes with assessment are probably the most notable or visual element of this transition to competency-based medical education for a learner and the frontline teaching faculty. So when we talk about competency-based medical education, there's four elements that I think make up something that's competency-based. And one of those is this idea of programmatic assessment. Programmatic assessment means authentic assessment, assessment in the workplace by multiple observers over a longitudinal period, with then collation of that data for a summary or a global judgment. So that sounds pretty dry. And really what we're saying is we should get back to the heart of where medicine began, with a faculty observing what our trainees do, but multiple faculty, so that we have measures to ensure the reliability of those observations, and then combining all of those observations into one aggregate decision of this individual is showing the abilities to progress from novice to intermediate, or from intermediate to advanced, or from advanced into practice. The idea of EPAs are this new model of a direct observation instrument, or a work-based assessment, and they're being employed across Canada and the US and in the UK and in the Netherlands and in a number of different regions. What an EPA is it's a unit of work, something that is part of the practice of an intensivist or an emergency physician or psychiatrist. So it's what we do, with a framework that asks, here's what we want you to look at. And then the observer says, can I entrust you to do this? And so the scale is somewhere from I had to do everything to I only had to be there for minor remindments of missed opportunities or opportunities for efficiency, to the far end of the scale, which is I didn't really need to be there. You could have completed this independently. I don't think EPAs are original in the sense of being a direct observation or a work-based assessment instrument. What I think is novel about an EPA is the E, the idea of entrustment, that we can give to our trainee a varying degree of responsibility to carry out that work-based act that typically would be our responsibility as the attending physician.
So I like that you stressed upon that word entrustment, and is how the faculty is perceiving that, moving from traditional assessment where we are so used to grade somebody according to the percentage or according to the grade A, B, C, and now have to kind of move away from that and then go to this entrustment concept. How the change has been perceived by the faculty.
So I think the challenge for faculty is as follows. Work-based assessment, or an EPA, is of greater effort than what some of our current assessment models are. So prior to this transition towards competency-based medical education in Canada, most residents in our training programs would be assessed using some type of in-training exam, a multiple choice or a short answer question, or maybe even an essay question type of exam, maybe an oral exam where we could structure this outside of our clinical responsibility. And then we'd complete at the end of each rotation, often long after it's passed, not with any supporting evidence, an end of rotation report. In Canada, we call them in training assessment reports. ITAs have some variation in most medical jurisdictions. And so the actual workload was low, but the discrimination, the utility for both a residency program to understand which residents were excelling, which were not, which needed early remediation, which needed more significant remediation, and which residents could really excel, that was never really effectively achieved with these forms. And for the learners, you'd get data on knowledge, but not on the performance of the work that you did every day. I'm still a strong believer in multiple choice exams and short answer question exams. They're very effective at producing knowledge, but there is not a component there of all the other skills and abilities that are essential to be a pediatrician or a family physician. So for faculty, it's a bit of a zero-sum game. The downside, of course, is that there's a requirement that you actually observe what you purport your trainees to be doing. And this does not need to be in an intensive, prolonged manner, but small biopsies of performance sampled over time. But the plus side is the data that you get about how your trainees are performing is much more specific, oriented to correcting behaviors. And for a learner, the feedback that provided from these work-based assessments, these EPAs, can really help guide them as they try to advance and progress towards being an independent physician in practice.
And do you think that there is a potential that this EPA will prolong the training? Because traditionally, if I enter into the medicine program, I'm guaranteed that I will finish in 4 years' time. But with this concept of EPA, now the learners are a bit anxious or apprehensive that they might not finish and they have to, and that might create kind of future problem where a lot of trainees not able to finish their training program. Do you foresee that problem?
In fact, I see the opposite. So let me walk through the answer in a couple steps. So when we talk about competency-based medical education, we say that we have an outcome. We have specific abilities that we define as the marker or the goal for completion. That's one element of competency-based medical education. So in Canada, we use the CanMEDS framework as that collection of different abilities and competencies that a successful practitioner in internal medicine needs to achieve. The second element is this idea of stage progression. Rather than saying you are a trainee by your associated calendar year, you are in your first year of training, you're in your second year of training, and your third year of training, we actually define different abilities by stage. And so we talk of 4 stages in Canada. They're not unique, but it essentially moves you from novice to intermediate to expert. The third element is this idea of programmatic assessment, where you have multiple assessments in the workplace environment by multiple observers to ensure a reliable and valid collection or attestation of performance. And then the last idea is that you have tailored learning, that you allow some flexibility to the program to accelerate learners forward, not based on what the calendar says, but based on what they can do. So everybody gets anxious about this idea of competency-based education extending training. The early data, a paper published most recently by Newison, who reports on the experiences of the orthopedic surgery program at the University of Toronto. I believe it's a 5-year report, shows that they had about a 15% reduction in training time overall. So that's our earliest data. Now, as I said at the top of the show, a lot of our assumptions or a lot of our theoretical ideas about the benefits of competency-based education still need to be challenged and still need to be evaluated. But the earliest data suggests that actually trainees, at least in Toronto and at least in orthopedic surgery, are graduating about 15% ahead of expected time. And the reason is this. For the most part, our trainees are excellent. The process of getting into a residency position is such that we're selecting excellent candidates who are highly motivated, highly intelligent, and are really looking for opportunities to develop and grow. But our current system says there's lots of speed bumps or breaks that prevent you from moving forward. You need to wait until the calendar year turns over, until you can move into that senior registrar period, regardless of whether you've demonstrated that ability 6, 8, 12 months in advance. So if we have a system where we want to say not what is your ability based by calendar year, but what is actually your ability based on observation in clinical practice? If we are allowing flexibility to our trainees to accelerate their learning, to actively seek out input that says, this is how you better and more efficiently refine your practice as a physician. And if we have a system that allows them to capture those observations and then based on those observations, move them forward, I actually think our highly motivated trainees are not going to spend longer period in time in training, but we'll see a slight reduction. Is it going to be dramatic? I don't think so. The experience of decades of training specialists in radiology or specialists in emergency medicine has probably found a pretty sweet spot of whether it takes 3, 4, or 5 years. And so I don't imagine it's going to be reduced by 40%, but certainly early evidence shows that trainees are actually graduating ahead of what the typical trajectory has been from the traditional educational program.
And do you think that EPA will become a gold standard method in future, and should all higher professional educators should switch to EPAs?
I don't think we have enough data to answer that. We should be cautious anytime that something new comes along and we imagine that it's superior just because it's new to old ways of training. I do think the idea of authentic work-based assessment is essential. And I think moving forward, the gold standard will be actual observation of what you do in practice. I think that's required in terms of giving good feedback to advance our learners' progression and to ensure to the public that we actually know that your surgeon can effectively take out your gallbladder. The current model in many sites is an attestation at the end of a rotation without a lot of supporting evidence, and then a really hard written exam and oral exam. But at no point has anyone actually watched the performance in the operating room and captured that data. So work-based assessment, I think, will maintain the gold standard. The idea of entrustment, I think, is innovative. It gets us back to the origin of how we as educators have historically arranged our teaching of trainees. In that previous mentorship model, it was always a sense of, do I need to be here for the entire patient encounter? Do I need to be here for only a portion of this procedure? Do I need to be here only as the senior trainee runs this clinic or runs rounds wards? How much do I need to be there? That's always been the model. And so I think this idea of entrustment really kind of brings us back to the roots. But we'll need to wait and see. We'll have a sense in the coming 2 to 5 years if EPAs are discriminating trainee performance like we imagine, whether they're useful for faculty and they can be applied appropriately, and whether the data actually is effective both for the formative assessment and the ongoing learning of our trainings, but also to inform summative assessments about progression from novice to intermediate to advanced.
You mentioned a few of the challenges, but what are the broad challenges in implementing EPAs in higher health professional education?
So I think any challenge begins with a change management challenge. If we're going to imagine implementation of a new system, that implementation requires fixed and in-kind resources. The programmatic assessment idea that we discussed very briefly requires capturing, typically in real time, multiple data points from multiple observers. And so for the residency program that we run at McMaster University, that means we have hundreds of data points per resident per year. Eric Warm, an internal medicine program director at Cincinnati, has approximately 4,000 data points per trainee over the course of training. So what does that require? That requires some electronic portfolio to capture, aggregate, and provide dashboard metrics of performance. Paper systems just can't tolerate in an effective way that volume of data. So you need these types of fixed costs in terms of platforms to allow some of the innovations around programmatic assessment and EPAs to be effective. But you also have in-kind costs. The challenges to reorganizing rotations that allow maximal effectiveness in terms of training, at the same time meeting the service needs that these trainees provide, are in-kind costs that need to be considered. The faculty development to onboard faculty to a new system is an in-kind cost that needs to be incorporated into any change plan. The reorganization of the labor force, where you may have trainees graduating rather than a single bolus on an annual basis, but rather as a number of exit points, actually may improve patient safety and be more responsive to health human resources needs. But it's an in-kind cost that needs to reorganize what has been a long established process for decades and decades.
Okay, if the budding educator want to design EPA or want to develop an expertise in this competency based medical education, what's the process, and are there any other resources out there to train the trainer? uh,
So if you're going to design your own EPAs, my first advice would be to familiarize yourself with the language. And a great paper written by Robert Englander in Medical Teacher in 2017 captures the various nuances as to how EPAs are described per jurisdiction. The sad reality of medical education literature is that our use of terms is inconsistent. And so this paper provides, I think, a very helpful grounding in what is meant by EPAs across jurisdictions and what are the unifying principles behind an EPA. So I'd go read that first. And then the next thing is I would go and look at how different jurisdictions are actually producing EPAs, and most of them are freely available. The Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada has EPAs that are actual live for different programs. So emergency medicine is live, anesthesia, medical oncology, surgical foundations, amongst others, are all there. Although you may not be a specialist in that area, there's lots of familiarity with how the structure would work and how you could sub in and out subject matter content relevant to your discipline into that form. The ACGME in the US also has EPAs for all of its specialties. And so that would ensure that you would see subject matter content relevant to any discipline in which you practice. And so I'd look there rather than starting from scratch and reinventing the wheel, looking to modify an EPA to make sense in your context and in your discipline.
One of the things that I kind of struggle with is that idea of the number that you come up with, especially associated with the procedural skills. Say, for example, if I have to or declare him competent in placing the central line, what's the number of procedures that he should be performing before I kind of entrust him as a competent? And that number varies across the globe, and there's no kind of unanimous agreement that any trainee who goes through the curriculum should have performed this number of set procedures in order to become competent. Do you think that can be a problem?
So let me unpack your question in two ways. The first way is how many EPAs should a discipline have? Remember, an EPA is only one finite piece of work. So in Canada, as in the US, we decided to use EPAs as sentinel work. So in emergency medicine, we have 28 EPAs, I believe. Does that mean we only do 28 things in emergency medicine? Of course not. But for issues of feasibility, we've decided there are 28 sentinel work tasks that need to be observed multiple times to ensure that a trainee can competently perform them. When you get into high numbers of articulating every last work task, you end up with tens of hundreds of EPAs, which suddenly you can't collect enough data points to have any reliable measure. And so the decision always is we are going to choose what are the sentinel tasks relevant to that discipline. And how do you choose the sentinel task? You ask the representatives from those disciplines are what are the things that are essential that really need to be observed. And so in emergency medicine, for example, we think it's essential that you know how to emergently intubate and ventilate an emergency department patient. If you can't manage that airway skill and that ventilation skill, then you probably shouldn't be in emergency medicine. There are a number of other tasks, such as lumbar punctures, which are really a part of our everyday practice, but we don't have a specific EPA for that because we think we capture that technical performance, that other related motor skill in an EPA around the placement of a central venous catheter. Very different, but also there's enough correlate in terms of performance that we think that we can generalize in that context from one to the other. So the second part of your question is how many? We don't know. And this is one of the assumptions, and I think this is how an ongoing program evaluation will need to ensure that an adequate number of observations. But looking at the literature for OSCEs, looking at some early literature around portfolio development, from the Netherlands in obstetrics and gynecology, looking at typical mini CEX observations. We're probably looking in the range of a minimum of 10 to 15 observations in order to have a reliable signal of performance. What's interesting, of course, is that the structure that we're using in Canada is not some quantitative structure. We're not using a Q sum score. We're not using another quantitative determination of what's your mean score with a cut point. What we are actually using is expert determination based on the observations captured. So what I mean is, if you perform 10 emergency department intubations and subsequent ventilation, the entrustment scores and the associated narrative comments are taken in aggregate. And much like a jury weighs the evidence, the competency committee weighs that evidence before them to say, we see a pattern that's sustained that this individual is safe to perform emergency department intubations and ventilation in an unsupervised manner.
Okay, that's very helpful. I'm pretty sure that this is quite challenging concept and it will evolve over the period of time. Now, last but most important, what's your advice to budding educators?
If you want to start being part of the conversation in competency-based medical education, I think there's a stretch goal and in more of an achievable goal. There is an emerging conversation that's happening around this. The Association of Medical Educators of Europe conference is being preceded by a CBME conference. And so if you want to have conversations with medical educators from around the globe, I'd encourage you to register for that conference and be a part of that. There is a lot of literature that's coming out on CBME. And so I would start to read and have an understanding of what the issues that are emerging and how they might impact your discipline or your educational practice. The stretch goal, I think, is a little bit more challenging, which is, although you may not be able to implement all the components of CBME, an outcomes framework, stage progression of training, programmatic assessment, and tailored learning, I think looking at incorporating a work-based assessment into your program, and perhaps even a competency committee, a committee that looks and adjudicates on a regular, probably quarterly basis at a minimum, the performance of trainees, providing educational prescriptions about progressing forward or maybe remediating areas of deficiency. Those are things that can be done and would be best practices, would improve the quality of your residency program without having to say, we're going to pull it all apart and start from scratch with a complete implementation of a competency-based medical education curriculum.
Great. Thanks for that, Jonathan. And if upcoming educators need some advice or want to contact you, what's your best contact details?
So you can reach me on the Twitter at Sherbino, Sherbino. I hope they would follow the Keyline Podcast. You can find that on iTunes. Or come over to the International Clinician Educators blog. It's a blog that attempts to practically address the challenges we all face as frontline clinician educators, wrestling with curriculum, assessment, remediation, best practices for learning, and written from a perspective that is digestible and implementable. And the archives, I think you'll find something for everybody there.
Absolutely. I'm very much fan of Keyline Podcast, and it's really very useful resource for all medical educators out there. So strongly recommend that. Thanks, Jonathan. It was pleasure talking to you, and I'm pretty sure this will ignite a lot of conversations on this topic, and you will get a lot of queries from the budding educators.
Thanks, Swapnil. I really enjoyed being here and chatting with you today.